That old bacon grease jar wasn't just kitchen waste. It was Eleanor's quiet weapon against the brutal 1974 crisis. While everyone else was drowning in worry and cutting every corner, she was silently turning tiny daily habits into real money. No big plans, no fancy accountant, just simple everyday routines that stretched her husband's modest paycheck like magic. By the end of that year, those small habits had completely changed her family's life. Now I'm going to share the rest of those powerful habits with you. If you want to make your home stronger in today's tough economy, stick with me till the end. Margaret lived 3 houses down. She had a garden that produced more zucchini than any one family could reasonably consume. Every August, she would stand at her back fence with an expression that was equal parts pride and desperation, surrounded by zucchini of increasingly alarming size. Eleanor had no garden. She had a small backyard with more shade than sun, and she had accepted this limitation without bitterness. But she had a sewing machine, and Margaret needed her daughter's confirmation dress taken in by 2 inches before the 15th. No money changed hands, no receipt was written. Eleanor spent 40 minutes with her seam ripper and her machine, and she came home with a bag containing 3 zucchini, a bunch of Swiss chard, 4 tomatoes, and a small jar of Margaret's bread and butter pickles. That was the 22nd habit, and it was older than money itself. Bartering is not a quaint historical footnote. It is a living, breathing economic strategy that most modern Americans have simply forgotten they are allowed to use. Eleanor never forgot. She understood that every skill she possessed had a value that existed entirely outside the dollar system. She could sew. She could bake. She was an excellent note-taker and had helped 2 neighbors write letters to their landlords, their insurance companies, their children's schools. She could watch children for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. She could diagnose a failing houseplant with alarming accuracy. Every one of these abilities was currency. The 23rd habit was knowing what her neighbors needed and remembering it. Eleanor kept a casual mental inventory of the people within 4 houses in either direction, not in a calculating way, in the way of someone who paid genuine attention. She knew that the Henderson's boy had outgrown his winter boots. She knew that old Mr. Pataki's eyesight made reading small print difficult. She knew that the young mother on the corner was exhausted and hadn't had 2 hours to herself in recent memory. Knowing what people needed meant she was always positioned to offer something useful, and offering something useful meant people were always quietly looking for ways to return the favor. In 2026, this is called a mutual aid network. In 1974, Eleanor called it being a good neighbor. The mechanism is identical. The 24th habit was the neighborhood lending system. Eleanor did not own a ladder tall enough to clean her gutters. She didn't need to. She borrowed Frank's ladder every October and returned it with a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. Frank borrowed her good stockpot twice a year for large family gatherings. Nobody kept score in writing. Everyone kept score in memory, in goodwill, in the texture of a relationship that made the whole street feel like something more than a collection of separate households. In 2026, you can replicate this with a Buy Nothing group, a neighborhood Facebook page, a simple group text. The tools are better than anything Eleanor had. The willingness to use them is the only missing ingredient. The 25th habit was group buying without ego. Eleanor learned to make her own yogurt from a neighbor who had emigrated from Greece and found American dairy prices offensive. In exchange, Eleanor taught that same neighbor how to make pie crust that didn't turn to concrete. Both women walked away richer in practical knowledge. Neither spent a dollar. In 2026, YouTube has made this almost infinitely scalable. The knowledge is free. The application is where most people stop short. Eleanor never stopped at the knowledge. She always went straight to the application, even when the first attempt was imperfect, even when the yogurt was too thin, or the pie crust cracked at the edges. The 27th habit was community preservation. When peaches were in season and cheap, Eleanor didn't just buy enough for her family, she bought extra, and she and Margaret spent a Saturday afternoon putting up jars of peach preserves together. The labor was shared, the cost was shared. Each woman went home with twice the number of jars she could have made alone in half the time. Canning has seen a genuine revival in 2026, and for good reason. A jar of quality fruit preserves at a farmer's market now runs $6 to $9. Eleanor's version cost her roughly 40 cents in fruit and fuel per jar. The math is staggering when you multiply it across a winter's worth of breakfasts. The 28th habit was refusing the illusion of self-sufficiency. Eleanor never pretended she could do everything alone. She knew that isolation was expensive, that the American mythology of the lone, self-made individual, the family that needs no one, was not just emotionally hollow, it was financially ruinous. The families who came through 1974 the best were not the ones who needed the least from others. They were the ones who were most deeply woven into the fabric of their communities. In 2026, that truth is still true. It has just become harder to act on because we've built lives in which we barely know our neighbors' names. Eleanor knew everyone's name. She knew their needs, she knew their skills, she knew their schedules. And that knowledge was worth more than any coupon she ever clipped. But knowledge of your community is one thing, knowledge of yourself is another. And Eleanor was about to be forced into a confrontation with the second kind that she had been quietly avoiding. There was one evening in November of 1974 that Eleanor has never spoken about publicly. Because Eleanor is not a public person. She is a real woman. And real women carry certain evenings privately for a very long time. But I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because this video is not just about saving money. It is about what saving money actually costs you emotionally. And nobody talks about that part. It was a Wednesday. The children were asleep. Her husband was working a late shift. The house was quiet in the way that quiet can sometimes feel like pressure rather than rest. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open, and she did the math for December. The numbers did not work. Not by a catastrophic margin, not by a margin that would mean real disaster, but by enough, by the specific grinding enough that meant Christmas would be almost nothing, that the coat she had been planning to replace would have to wait another year, that the small, quiet dreams she permitted herself, a new houseplant, a paperback novel, an afternoon at the cinema, would all have to be set aside again. She closed the notebook. She put her head down on her arms on the kitchen table, and she stayed there for a few minutes, in the dark, in the quiet. This is not a habit. This is just a human being. But what she did next was the 29th habit, and it is one of the most important ones. She got back up. Not immediately, not with false cheerfulness. She sat up, she looked at the closed notebook, and she made a decision that was not about money at all. It was about narrative. She refused to tell herself a story in which she was a victim of her circumstances. She was not a victim. She was a manager. She was the chief operating officer of a small, complex, living enterprise called her family, and the conditions of that enterprise were difficult, but not impossible. There was a difference. She insisted on that difference, even when the gap between them felt very thin. In 2026, we talk constantly about financial anxiety. It is real. It is widespread. It is, for many people, debilitating. But there is a specific cognitive habit that Eleanor practiced that modern psychology has since confirmed as genuinely protective. She focused on what she could control and released what she couldn't. She could not control oil prices. She could not control interest rates or her husband's salary or the cost of children's shoes. She could control her kitchen. She could control her mending basket. She could control the notebook and the jars and the decisions she made between waking and sleeping every single day. That circle of control, small as it was hers absolutely. and she worked it completely. The 30th habit was accepting help without shame. The church she attended had a quiet, dignified program, no announcements, no public lists. If a family was struggling, they could leave a note in a specific box by the side door, and the following week a bag would appear on their porch before sunrise. No faces, no transactions, no debt of gratitude that felt like a weight. Eleanor used it once, in January of 1975. A bag of staples, beans and rice and canned goods, appeared on her porch on a Tuesday morning before her children were awake. She stood in the doorway for a moment, holding it. Then she brought it inside and made breakfast. She did not feel humiliated. She had decided, long before that morning, that accepting help when it was offered with dignity was not weakness, it was wisdom. It was participation in a system of mutual care that she herself had contributed to and would continue to contribute to for years after her own need had passed. In 2026, food banks, community fridges, mutual aid networks, and SNAP benefits exist and are underused by families who qualify for them because of a shame that Eleanor would find both understandable and unnecessary. Use what exists. Contribute when you can. The circle is larger than any one family's good or bad year. The 31st habit was talking to her children honestly. Not with despair, not with numbers that would frighten them, but with a matter-of-fact clarity that treated them as participants in the family's life rather than passengers insulated from its realities. She told her oldest, who was 12, "We are being careful this season. That means we choose what matters most and we let the rest go." Her oldest nodded and, without being asked, stopped requesting things, started noticing things instead, started helping in ways that 12-year-olds rarely help unless they understand that help is genuinely needed. That child grew up to be one of the most financially grounded adults Eleanor has ever known. The 32nd habit was giving anyway. Even in the tight months, even in November of 1974, when the numbers didn't work, Eleanor set aside something small for someone else. A jar of preserves for a neighbor who was ill, an hour of her time for the young mother on the corner who needed 2 hours to herself. She did this not from surplus, but from principle. She understood that the habit of generosity, maintained even in scarcity, protected something in her that no budget could quantify. It kept her from contracting into herself. It kept her connected. It reminded her that she was not just surviving, she was still living. She lifted her head from the kitchen table that November night, and she opened the notebook again. She found 3 places to cut. She found 1 place to be creative. She found a way through December that wasn't what she had hoped for, but was real and solid and hers. Then she went to bed, and she slept. It was the 23rd of the month. Eleanor had $8.40 left in the grocery jar. She had 7 days until the next budget reset. She sat at the kitchen table. She did most of her serious thinking there, and she looked at that $8.40 for a long time. She counted it twice, as if the second count might produce a different result. It didn't. 7 days, 3 children, 1 husband, $8.40. Let me do that math for you in 2026 terms. $8.40 in 1974 is roughly $55 to $60 in today's money, which sounds more manageable until you remember that a single grocery run for a family of 5 in 2026 can consume that in 1 aisle. Eleanor took a breath. Then she did what she always did when the numbers were tight. She stopped looking at the money and started looking at the kitchen. This was the 33rd habit. Reframe the question. The question is not, what can I buy with $8? The question is, what do I already have and what can I make from it? She did a full inventory, out loud, quietly, to herself, moving through every shelf and drawer. There was half a bag of dried pinto beans, a nearly full bag of rice, 4 potatoes starting to soften at the edges, an onion, 2 cans of tomatoes she had been saving for something specific, though she couldn't now remember what, a heel of bread, 3 eggs, a half-used can of evaporated milk, some cornmeal, the grease jar, faithful as ever. She stood back and looked at all of it. She had enough. Not comfortably, not easily, but enough, if she was precise. The 34th habit was strategic meal architecture for scarcity. She planned every single meal for the next 7 days before she spent a cent. Breakfast Monday through Sunday, oatmeal or cornmeal porridge with evaporated milk, made rich and filling and something the children could actually look forward to. Lunch, bean soup, varied daily by whatever seasoning was available, paired with the remaining bread and then with cornbread she would make herself. Dinner, rice and beans 4 nights, with the potatoes stretched across 2 nights as the primary starch, the eggs used strategically on the 7th night in a simple, filling frittata with the remaining onion and whatever odds and ends were left. She spent $4.20 at the store. More dried beans, because she was running low, a small piece of salt pork for flavoring, because fat and salt could transform plain beans into something that felt like a real meal rather than a survival ration. A bunch of kale marked down to 30 cents because it was slightly wilted, which meant nothing once it hit a hot pan. She came home with $4.20 still in her hand. The 35th habit was flavor as a force multiplier. This sounds small. It is not small. Eleanor understood that the psychological sustainability of an austere diet depended almost entirely on whether the food tasted good. Not expensive, good. There is an enormous difference. She used her spice shelf aggressively that week. Cumin in the beans, bay leaves in the rice, a scrape of nutmeg in the cornmeal porridge, fresh garlic, which she had on a braid above the stove, pressed into almost everything savory. The salt pork in the beans created a depth of flavor that made her youngest ask for seconds twice. Her family did not feel like they were being rationed. They felt like they were eating well. That distinction was not accidental, it was engineered. In 2026, a well-stocked spice shelf is one of the highest return investments a frugal kitchen can make. Individual spices cost very little per use. Their ability to transform cheap ingredients into genuinely good food is disproportionate to their cost. Eleanor would agree with this so forcefully she might shake you by the lapels. The 36th habit was eliminating all waste to 0 that final week. 0, she meant it literally. The water the beans soaked in overnight was used to start the cooking. The potato peels were fried in the grease jar until crisped and eaten as a side with dinner. The kale stems, which most people discard, were chopped fine and cooked long and slow into the bean pot, where they dissolved into flavor and nutrition invisibly. The heel of bread went into a small pudding on Wednesday evening, soaked in the evaporated milk with a whisper of cinnamon, baked until just set. Her children thought it was dessert. It was stale bread and old milk, transformed by patience and heat into something that made them smile. Sunday evening arrived. Eleanor counted the grocery jar. $3.15 remaining. She had fed her family of 5 on $5.25. She wrote it in her notebook. She underlined it once. Not because she was proud of the deprivation. She wasn't. She was proud of the precision. She was proud of the intelligence and the care and the refusal to panic that turned a genuinely tight situation into a week that her children remembered years later as the week their mother made that really good bean soup. They had no idea. Or maybe they did, and they loved her more for it. The grocery jar reset on the 1st of the month. She put the money in slowly, counting each bill. She was ready to do it all again. But this time, the month was going to end differently. This time, she was going to have something left over. and what she did with what was left over would be the final lesson of the entire year. The 1st of December arrived like every first of every month, cold, demanding, full of numbers that needed facing. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table one final time with her notebook open to the last page of the year. Not the last page she had written on, the last page she had set aside, blank and waiting since January. The page where the total would live. She had been adding to it all year, small notations in the margin, a number here, a notation there, the running record of every deliberate choice made between January and November. Now she was going to add it all up. She picked up her pencil. The 37th habit was the annual accounting. Not a monthly budget review, though she did that too. This was something larger and more intentional. Once a year, Eleanor sat down and calculated not just what she had spent, but what she had saved by choosing differently. The difference between what something would have cost at full price and what she had actually paid. The value of every meal made from scratch instead of purchased ready-made. The replacement cost of every garment repaired instead of replaced. The market value of every jar of preserved food sitting in her basement. This practice served two purposes. First, it made the invisible visible. Frugality is psychologically difficult to sustain, partly because its rewards are abstract. You don't see the money you saved, you only ever see the money you have. The annual accounting forced the savings into a concrete, written, undeniable form. Second, it motivated the next year. Looking at a real number, a number you produced with your own hands and choices and discipline, is one of the most powerful things you can do for your future financial behavior. It makes the abstract personal. It makes the effort feel worth it in a way that a general sense of being careful never quite achieves. Eleanor added the columns slowly, line by line, month by month. The kitchen savings from cooking scratch meals instead of convenience food, across 12 months, an average of $31 per month saved. In today's money, that is approximately $200 a month, $2,400 a year from the kitchen alone. The clothing savings from mending, second-hand buying, and off-season purchasing. Across 12 months, she had avoided approximately $47 in replacement clothing costs. In today's money, that is roughly $300. The community exchange savings, the bartered services, the shared bulk buying, the preserved food from cooperative canning days. She calculated this conservatively and still arrived at a number that surprised even her, roughly $22 saved per month through community exchange. Over 12 months, $264. In today's money, approximately $1,700. The emergency fund discipline, the fact that the furnace crisis had been absorbed without debt, without the interest payments that debt would have generated, without the cascading financial damage of a balance that grows while you sleep. She estimated the interest she had not paid at roughly $18. In today's money, just over $100. Small in isolation, significant as a habit practiced across a lifetime. She added the columns. She checked them twice. The pencil hovered. The total for the year, across all categories, all habits, all quiet and invisible choices made in a small house on an ordinary street in 1974, was just over $412 saved. In 2026 dollars, adjusting for cumulative inflation, that number is approximately $2,600 to $2,800. She looked at it for a long moment. $412. Saved not through deprivation, not through suffering, not through any single dramatic sacrifice. Saved through 38 habits so quiet that no neighbor, no store clerk, no passing stranger had ever noticed them operating. This is the 38th and final habit, and it is the one that made all the others possible. She wrote it at the bottom of the page, beneath the total, in her careful, slightly slanted handwriting. Consistency. not perfection. She had failed at things this year. The stock pot had boiled dry twice. She had bought something impulsively once in March and regretted it for a week. She had missed a week of notebook entries in September when the youngest was sick and the house was chaos. But she had come back, every time, to the table, to the notebook, to the jars, to the pencil and the list and the quiet daily practice of choosing care over convenience. Consistency, she understood, was not the absence of failure. It was the decision to continue after failure. It was the return, again and again and again. The $412 was not sitting in a jar. It was distributed invisibly throughout the life of her family, in the coats that still fit, in the basement full of preserved food, in the relationships with neighbors that meant she was never truly alone in a crisis, in the children who had watched her all year and learned, without a single lesson being formally delivered, that a dollar was a thing to be respected and a life was a thing to be managed with intention. She closed the notebook. She put the kettle on. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning to fall, soft and indifferent, on the street where Eleanor lived. She watched it through the kitchen window. She had made it through another year, and she had done it with something left over. I want to talk to you directly now, not about Eleanor, about you. You found this video for a reason. Maybe you opened your grocery bill this week and felt that specific sinking feeling. Maybe you looked at your bank account on the 20-something of the month and the number was smaller than it should have been. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you're just quietly, persistently stressed in the way that millions of Americans are quietly, persistently stressed in 2026, and nobody around you is talking about it honestly. Eleanor's story is not a history lesson. It is a mirror. The woman who sat at that kitchen table in 1974, pencil in hand, staring at the gap between what came in and what went out, she is not a stranger to you. You know that feeling. You may be sitting with that feeling right now. Here is what I want you to take from her year. You do not need to do 38 things tomorrow. You need to do one. Pick the one habit from Eleanor's story that felt most immediately possible. Maybe it's the notebook. Maybe it's the grease jar, which sounds small and is genuinely not. Maybe it's texting a neighbor you haven't spoken to in 6 months and starting a conversation that might eventually become a buying club or a skill swap or just a friendship that makes hard months feel less isolating. One habit, this week, practiced with consistency. That is how Eleanor started, not with a system, with a jar and a pencil and a decision to look honestly at her life. Here is something else I want to say, and I want to say it carefully. Frugality in 2026 is not the same as frugality in 1974. Eleanor faced serious constraints, so do you, but you also face pressures she never encountered. You face algorithmic advertising designed by teams of psychologists to find the specific weaknesses in your financial discipline and press on them constantly through a device you carry in your pocket. You face a culture that has made spending feel like self-expression and saving feel like deprivation. You face the genuine psychological weight of comparison, of seeing every single day on every screen a version of life that costs more than your income allows. Eleanor never had to fight that particular battle. So if you have tried to be careful with money and found it harder than it logically should be, I want you to understand that the difficulty is not a personal failure. The system surrounding you is built to make it difficult. That is not an excuse to stop trying. It is context that should make you gentler with yourself when you stumble. Eleanor stumbled. She put her head down on the kitchen table in November, and she stayed there for a few minutes. Then she got back up. That is the whole story. Get back up. The 38 habits in this video are not revolutionary. They are not secret. They are not new. They are old, and they are quiet, and they work with a consistency that no financial product, no investment app, no side hustle course has ever matched, because they operate at the level of daily life, at the level of the kitchen and the mending basket and the notebook and the community. They work because they are real. In 2026, with grocery prices where they are, with energy costs where they are, with the general grinding pressure of an economy that asks more from ordinary families than it has in decades, these habits are not nostalgic. They are urgent. Eleanor's $2,800 saved in today's money did not come from sacrifice. It came from attention, from the daily, renewable, completely free resource of paying attention to your own life. You have that resource. You have it right now. The notebook cost $1. The pencil is probably already in your house somewhere. The jar is in your cabinet. Start tonight. Write down what you spent today, all of it. Be honest with yourself, the way Eleanor was honest with herself, the way her notebook was her honest mirror. Look at the number. Let it be real. Then turn the page. Write down what you can control tomorrow. That list, that small, humble, powerful list, is the beginning of everything Eleanor built. It is the foundation that held her family through the worst economic crisis of their generation. It can hold yours too. If this video meant something to you, if Eleanor's story felt familiar or useful or honest, share it with someone who needs it. Not because this channel needs the numbers, though it does appreciate them, because the person in your life who is quietly stressed about money this month deserves to know that there is a path through that doesn't require perfection, doesn't require deprivation, and doesn't require anything they don't already have. A jar, a pencil, a kitchen table, and the decision to sit back down. Thank you for being here. Eleanor would be glad you watched.